wonderful to be among so many distinguished individuals, and it is now my great pleasure and an honor to present our distinguished featured speaker, Dean Harold Koh, the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale. He's a leading expert on international law and a prominent advocate of human and civil rights, for which he has received much recognition and numerous prizes. He's been a member of the Yale Law School faculty since 1985 and its dean since 2004. From 1998 to 2001, Dean Koh served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Before joining Yale, he practiced law at Covington and Burling and at the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. You must realize that this is a very abbreviated introduction. When we looked up all of the things that could be said about Dean Koh, it would have taken me much, much longer to do him justice. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome Dean Koh.
Let me get the technical arrangements set here for a second. Let me say first, what an extraordinary honor it is to be here with these two gentlemen who I admire so much. I'm sure you were wondering, how important an event is this? I'll give you this rule of thumb. If it's a very distinguished person, they're introduced by one dean. If they're really great, they're introduced by two deans. But when they are extraordinary beyond measure, it takes three deans. And I'm particularly delighted because both Fred and Ricky are friends of mine, also especially delighted because they're both graduates of Yale Law School. The inimitable Guido Calabresi, previous dean, said to me, "It is always a joy when a graduate of our school becomes a dean, because then you can take credit for all of the accomplishments of that dean at their school." It's what we call incorporation by reference. Now, for me, it's a particularly touching moment to be back here at GW Law School because, as doesn't maybe leap out, is that this is the school with which I have had the closest connection other than with Yale Law School. It is the school that gave me my first teaching job. I have taught here at the night program for 3 years at the beginning of my career. I courted my wife, who is a graduate and faculty member of GW, more than 25 years ago, and we're celebrating our anniversary. I parked over there, which is still a parking lot. I taught with my dear friends Ralph Steinhardt and Susan Karamanian in the Human Rights program at Oxford, and now, of course, Fred is the dean. And also in this room, I should just acknowledge the presence of mentors like Peter Truboff, who has helped me through my career starting at Covington and Burling, colleagues from the State Department like Catherine Brown and David Stewart, John Bellinger, with whom I worked, former students like Ed Swain, Betsy Anderson, who are now distinguished, Tara Mellish, distinguished human rights practitioners in their own right, and Steve Charnovitz too, I see you, Steve. So this is a great opportunity for me to say thank you for teaching me about the joys of a career in human rights and in teaching. Now, when I was thinking about this program, I was speaking to our beloved friend Rosie Abella, previous winner. She is, as you may know, an aficionado of animated cartoons. And she referred to it as the Tom and Jerry show, which as a young Korean boy growing up in America was one of my favorite cartoons. Now, as you may, I never remember which one was the mouse and which was the cat, but the energy that surrounded them, the interactivity, shall we say, of these two individuals combined with what I would call a happy warrior style, which characterizes great human rights practitioners, Nelson Mandela, these individuals here, happiness in the face of often extraordinarily discouraging situations. has been a source of tremendous delight. Now, I thought I would tell you a little bit about the Tom and Jerry show and the world they made and where it's led, because it's so fitting that this award be given to a human rights professor judge, Tom Buergenthal. You see his many accomplishments here, and you've heard about them in the video and in the program, and a human rights lawyer, Jerry Shestack, who as president of the ABA, as UN ambassador to the Human Rights Commission, commissioner of the U.S. Presidential Congressional Commission to improve the effectiveness of the UN, a counselor at the American Society of International Law. These two individuals have had extraordinary lifetimes in human rights, and working together, although often in parallel, they help to build the human rights environment in which we live. And that environment, I think, can be thought of, and this is the 60th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as falling into basically 4 eras. The first, an era of what could be called the universalization of human rights norms that ran into the middle of the Cold War. The second, a period of institutionalization of human rights values into government and non-governmental organizations. An era of operationalization, when institutions and norms started to work together to create an engine for human rights change. And then the era in which we now begin, the era of globalization. It started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and has gone through sub-eras. At the beginning, a period of global optimism in which the possibilities of globalization excited all of us, the internet, international travel, the network nature of our society. And then September 11th, when a second structure fell, not the Berlin Wall, but the Twin Towers. And then suddenly we were plunged into a period of pessimism. All of the tools of globalization were suddenly seen to be threatening. The internet as a way in which terrorists can cooperate, the airlines, now weapons, all of these, the financial interactivity of the system, something that could lead to financing of terrorist activity. Which brings us to what I call the post-Cold War period, which happily is about to begin. As well, next Tuesday is when it's going to begin. Now, to bring you to the present, let me just identify the role played by our 2 honorees in each of these eras. At the beginning, where the focus was universal norms, the paradigm violation genocide. It was the 4 Freedoms speech of Franklin Roosevelt, the treaties that followed from it, Dumbarton Oaks and the creation of the UN Charter, recognizing that the world order is to protect human rights, the building of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Convention, the first starting of a system of international adjudication of the kind in which Tom Buergenthal has participated with trials at Nuremberg and Tokyo, the creation of the International Court of Justice, the identification of certain kinds of offenses as crimes against humanity, and then the vertical link between the international and the domestic. The second wave of democracy that came after World War II and that brought democracy to countries such as Germany and Japan and other parts of Western Europe. This was the period in which, as you heard, Jerry and Tom got their start, where they found their passion, where in surviving and getting inspiration from their own family members, they found the passion that would lead them through their lifetimes. And this led in the 50s to the creation of human rights institutions that might actually implement these norms. The Economic and Social Council at the UN Human Rights Commission, where Jerry was our ambassador, the UN Human Rights Committee, of which Tom Buergenthal was the first U.S. representative, the treaty bodies, about which Tom wrote with Louis Sohn, the Helsinki process and the Strasbourg process, where both of them were involved in helping to create a human rights system for Central and Eastern Europe. The Inter-American system, where Tom was the Costa Rican judge. Because, of course, we are not a party to the American Convention, but the Costa Ricans decided that there could be no better message than to put Tom Buergenthal on. And then the NGO community, which has the Human Rights First, one example, an organization which was partly founded by Jerry Shestack. Institutions, governmental and non-governmental, that can give these norms force. And then, in the period leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the machine starts to operate. Implementation by working groups and special rapporteurs, the creation of regional systems, the development of national systems and national adjudication, the dramatic rise of NGO activity, which led us to the period in which I was lucky to serve in government, the immediate post-Berlin Wall period where we were flushed with excitement about the globalization of freedom in various parts of the world, the revival of international criminal adjudication leading to the signing of the Rome Treaty of the International Criminal Court, the expansion of regional systems and entities like NATO to address ethnic conflict, the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, which created a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the revival of US human rights policy in various areas, although with some significant failures, which I describe as but-see. Which leads us to today, the dawn of this post-Cold War world. And here we now are living the 21st century in an age of globalization, what Tom Friedman characterizes as hot, flat, and crowded, an interdependent world where the nation state has declining power, where there's growing network power, where global problems proliferate, and think of them, the economy, disease, terrorism, trafficking in human beings, and institutions which are globalizing but incompletely globalized, rights which are globalizing but incompletely globalized, governance structures, governmental and non-governmental, which are globalizing but incompletely. Which led to the foreign policy vision that our country had as of September 11th. It was, with some exceptions, but exceptions that proved the rule based on 4 simple ideas. Universal human rights based on the 4 freedoms of speech. Democracy promotion from the bottom up. A diplomatic approach based on strategic multilateralism and unilateralism only as a last resort. International law and institutions, and promoting global cooperation among global democracies to solve global problems. About a week before I left the State Department, I was asked to brief the incoming Secretary of State, Colin Powell, on the democracy and human rights policy of the United States, and I was given 30 seconds to do so. That's deliberation in government. And I said to him, Mr. Secretary, and there were 2 maps, one of the world in 1970 with about 30 democracies, another map in 2000 with about 120. And I said, Mr. Secretary, you see the pattern of history that the democracies are the ones which are solutions, the dictatorships are the ones that are problems. The major change between the last 30 years is so many more opportunities to cooperate with other global democracies, but the other change, so many global problems. And so our strategy must be to use global cooperation among global democracy to solve global problems, such as financial crisis, environmental injury, health problems, democracy building, and terrorism. Now, I believe that. I still believe that. I think Colin Powell believed it. But as you saw, a 4th and final piece, I think a piece which the 2 gentlemen behind me deeply shared, is a belief that in important respects, the United States is part of an interdependent world, and international law is in important respects part of our law. So these 4 values were ones that Jerry Shestack and Tom Buergenthal not only believed, they lived for these values, they lived these values. And today we live in a world that has been turned upside down. Universalism has been rejected in favor of double standards. Freedom from fear has been put forward as an overriding value. Democracy building has been done from the top down through often claims of a right to preemptive strikes. Diplomatic, an approach based on strategic unilateralism with the attendant antipathy to international law and indifference to global cooperation, and strangely, to my mind, an academic and legal effort to exclude international law from domestic law and to treat an illegitimate response to the war on terror as lawfare. And I think there have been 4 tragedies. We know them well, but it's worth reviewing them. Take Abu Ghraib, which I think really ripped the scab off the war on terror. In 2000, I testified before the Torture Committee that the United States is unalterably committed to a world without torture. As many of my colleagues who are here from the State Department knew, that was not a controversial statement. My statement had been cleared with every available government agency. We said there is no circumstance under which we ever deem torture to be an appropriate use of state power. And we have gone from 0 tolerance to 0 accountability. Some low-level prosecutions, multiple military investigations have produced close to no punishment, a grotesque effort to define torture out of practice, use of euphemisms, and increasingly an attempt to persuade the public that somehow torture is inevitable and justified as a tool regularly used in a war on terror. And part of that has been a popularization of torture, so that a popular television show, which I watch, 4 torture scenes a year before 9/11, now close to 100 a year, most of those involving U.S. officials committing war crimes, depicted as justifiably committing those crimes as instruments of state policy. And whatever you might think, these are messages that are being sent to the parts of the world that we are trying to persuade that we are right. And Guantanamo, we are all sick of it, tired of hearing of it. The costs are stunning. More suicides than pending cases. Virtually no convictions. The number of detainees down, very few considered high value. The costs in the millions at the time of an incredible economic crisis. Hundreds of habeas petitions filed. An extraordinary list of individuals who say it should be closed. The President, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, 8 Democratic candidates, 2 Republicans, all of our major allies. And yet, a few days ago, the statement that Guantanamo will stay open to be a problem for the next administration. And then I think the scapegoating of international law, this claim of lawfare. Jack Goldsmith, my student, is a very admirable person who has stood up for the rule of law in this administration, well chronicled in this book, The Terror Presidency, his refusal to issue an legal opinion, his withdrawal of the torture opinion. But look at this philosophy from one of our most committed rule of law people. The commander-in-chief ensnared by law. You know, I thought the commander-in-chief was a creature of law. I thought that law was what creates the commander-in-chief, and therefore the constraints on the commander-in-chief, like checks and balances, are actually part of what a commander-in-chief is. And then the idea that somehow globalization and a more conservative Supreme Court have motivated many in the academic American left to replace our Constitution, heavens, with the international human rights as a font of progressivism. And so, what I have described as this network, nations, NGOs, academics, international organizations, international community, weaving a web of international law and judicial institutions that threatens U.S. governmental interests. And unless we tackle this problem head on, it will continue to grow. Law is the problem and not the solution under this vision. Now, the impact on our global reputation, you all know. Favorable opinions, our country have fallen everywhere, particularly sharp in our most important allies. Take these charts, developed a number of years ago. In Germany, 85% of the people thought that Guantanamo was illegal, 65% in the UK. Here, in 1998, 61% of Germans thought we were doing a good job on human rights. Now, 78% think we're doing a bad job. So in this post-Cold War world, what should the new president do? And let me make 2 very simple points. First, as exhausted as people are, and as exhausted as the next president will be after the most grueling and lengthy presidential campaign, the next 8 years are so much more important than the last 8 because they will determine whether the pendulum pushed so far can be brought back rapidly or whether we'll stay stuck in the direction it has been, thus creating a new normal. Second, I think we have to recognize that there are so many problems that it cannot simply be that they are all subsumed by a policy based on the war on terror. So starting as early as next week, but perhaps on January 2009, what should be done? And I would suggest 4 simple steps: putting our house in order, closing Guantanamo, issuing executive orders, introducing national security legislation, respecting international law and institutions. Closing Guantanamo requires a concerted intergovernmental effort among different agencies to determine which of the detainees should be prosecuted, which extradited, which repatriated, which resettled. I think a special envoy could be appointed by next week. And remember the 2 precedents. One, the Iranian hostages crisis, in which a coordinated effort among 2 agencies led to the release of hostages on election day. And contrast that with the other example, the Clinton transition, which could not close Guantanamo, which led to them having to take ownership of that issue. The policy didn't change for 2 more years. And those were allowed to say that it was necessary as a feature of dealing with our refugee policy. Now, even the other day, I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I said something quite similar to this, and Senator Brownback from Kansas said to me, "Professor," this is not a term of respect down here, do you mean to say, he said, that these terrorists should be brought to America and to Kansas, Leavenworth, Kansas? I said, this is not part of my brief where they should be brought. However, Guantanamo clearly should be closed. Why are we not closing Guantanamo? Because of concerns about who will be brought in. And he persisted, and finally I said to him, Senator, Timothy McVeigh killed thousands of people in Oklahoma. He was brought to a supermax prison in Colorado. He was given due process of law. He was punished. He posed no threat to either his fellow inmates or to his community. And on that basis, we do have the capacities here, which we have built up over the years to address problems like this. We do not need Guantanamo, and your concerns about Kansas can't be the only reason why it stays open. Which means, among other things, the Defense Department should begin to shut down the facility. The various offices should be asked to answer to those who have concerns and issues on human rights and humanitarian law. The Justice Department should appoint a point person to deal with habeas issues. And perhaps most important, lawyers should be empowered, as they have not been recently, to review secret opinions and withdraw those which are obsolete or contrary to American law. And I think that on the first day, second day of the new administration, an executive order can be issued which closes Guantanamo by a date certain, makes clear that torture should not be done by any person employed or under contract to the U.S. government, clarify that the authorization of use of military force resolution does not authorize the invasion of human or civil rights, to establish a committee on national security law chaired by the Attorney General. With regard to past abuses, to create the equivalent of a 9/11 Truth Commission that can recommend, investigate, and then recommend various kinds of accountability measures, and to make sure that other detainees under U.S. control are not moved to black sites in an effort to control habeas. Now, I know you're saying, well, this is an Obama agenda, but it is candidate McCain who said, waterboarding is not complicated, it's torture. It was used in the Spanish Inquisition, it was used in Pol Pot, it's used against Buddhist monks today. Or national security legislation. Maybe in this town we can have legislation. Maybe we can actually have a legislative process. Maybe at a time in which the Republican candidate is saying, oh, we lost it. The Republican candidate is saying, I'll finish it without the slide, that American officials will never torture again, meaning that they have tortured till now. Maybe we should actually ban torture. Now, notice that Professor Goldsmith in his book says that the current administration's failure is to be inattentive to credible expressions of public concern for constitutional and international values. This has been a major source of his soft power. And so I think that on the international front, and this is my fourth suggestion, we should re-engage with international law and institutions. Let's start with the International Criminal Court Treaty. There are some who have said to me, there are changes of nuance in the Bush administration with regard to the criminal court. I'd say, yeah, like a 180-degree change of nuance. At the beginning of the administration, they wanted to kill the court. Now, in fact, it's not a new administration. It's this administration has consented to the Darfur case. It's supported prosecutions in Congo and Uganda. It's supported a Sierra Leone tribunal to prosecute Charles Taylor, supported the prosecution of his son, supported a Cambodian tribunal, supported the Milosevic and Saddam prosecution. John Bellinger, who is here today, has said they accept the reality of the International Criminal Court. And my question then is, why isn't our policy now positive engagement with the court? Why is our policy controlled by the dead letter of John Bolton, who is long since gone from the government? And my question is, why can't we immediately shift on January 20th to a positive engagement strategy leading to a removal of the Bolton letter, a signing or reassertion of the signature of the Rome Treaty on December 2000, and moving to eliminate barriers to legislative and executive barriers to ratification of the treaty? Or in Sudan, again, there's a high degree of consensus on what ought to be done. The 4 Ps, a peace process, peacekeepers, protecting people, refugees, and the internally displaced, punishing of perpetrators through ICC accountability, sanctions, and blood oil revenues. Those can be done quite quickly. And just imagine this, that a new president by February 1st has announced, I am closing Guantanamo, I have an executive order banning torture, I'm introducing legislation to take these various steps, and I'm going to re-engage with the International Criminal Court. What a signal that would send to the world. And I'll tell you something, when Barack Obama appeared in Berlin and hundreds of thousands of people appeared, they didn't appear because they thought he was going to continue the policies that have been going on for the last 30 years. And for the future, emphasizing democracy building in areas that have been ignored around the world, promoting private-public partnerships to stop blood resources, keeping the internet free, and other such things. Because we should remember that the war on terror is so much broader part of the foreign policy agenda. There are so many issues that need to be faced, not to mention, oh yes, the economy, energy prices, the cost of food and shelter and immigration. Well, you might say this is a fantasy, but look at what John McCain has said. We must pay decent respect to the opinions of mankind. We should fight the terrorists and defend the rights that are the foundations of our society. We cannot torture and treat inhumanely suspected terrorists. We must close Guantanamo and come to a common international understanding on the disposition of dangerous detainees. My view is his administration has a mandate to pursue these issues. Or candidate Obama, who speaks about dealing with HIV/AIDS, bringing an end to genocide in Darfur, maintaining the highest standards of human rights and civil liberties, close Guantanamo, restore Hughes, say no to torture. And he says if you are ready for change, you can elect a president who so believes. All these things are possible, he says, if you're ready for change. So what I suggest in closing that we can expect is a tale of 3 globalizations. The globalization of governance, the globalization of freedom, and increasingly the globalization of fear. And one thing the president can say, the new president, whoever he is we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But the fear is part of the globalization, the global spread of terrorism, the global spread of economic instability, the global energy crisis, the global food and housing crisis, the spread of disease. We need global solutions. We need global cooperation among global democracies to combat the globalization of fear. And let me conclude by suggesting that this is not something we should leave to political actors. It's a challenge for all of us. And I think the most important thing, it is something we must do because ours is a nation built on human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. It's to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity that we have a Constitution of the United States of America. If our country loses its close identification with human rights, we have lost the thing that defines us as a nation and as a people. That's something that Tom and Jerry never forgot. And so the question, after these dark years in the post-Cold War world, can we restore the world that Tom and Jerry tried to build? Thank you.